I thought taking a job as the night watchman for Silent Echo Caverns would be boring. It was simple enough. Check the entrance, monitor the cameras, and make sure no one wandered in after dark. The manager, a grizzled old man named Hal, assured me it was an easy paycheck. "This place runs itself," Hal had said with a shrug, handing me a flashlight and a laminated list of rules. "Just stick to these and you'll be fine." At first glance, the rules seemed strange, almost laughable. Rule 3. Never whistle inside the cavern. Rule 5. If you hear a voice call your name, don't answer. Rule 7. If the humming stops, leave immediately and lock the gate. I figured it was some kind of local superstition, the kind of folklore people pass down to keep tourists out. But the way Hal looked at me before he left, that brief moment where his jovial grin faltered, it made me pause. I shrugged it off at the time, thinking it was nothing. But as the first night dragged on, I realized something. The rules weren't there to protect the cavern. They were there to protect me. When I first took the job at Silent Echo Caverns, I didn't think twice about it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and I needed a change after my last job fell through. A night shift watching over a tourist site? Easy. I figured I'd get paid to sit around, maybe read a book, and occasionally check the cameras. The caverns were just outside of town, tucked away in a dense forest that always seemed too quiet, the kind of place you'd miss unless you were looking for it. As I drove up the winding dirt road that led to the site, I noticed how the air seemed heavier, the trees leaning in like they were keeping secrets. The visitor center wasn't much, just a small, single-story building with faded wooden walls and a tin roof. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp stone and old books. A row of dusty souvenirs lined the shelves, their bright colors muted in the dim light. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the cavern entrance, a deep, almost musical vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Hal, the manager, was waiting for me by the front desk. He handed me a flashlight and a laminated list of rules. "It's mostly quiet here," he said, "but stick to these, especially number 7. I glanced at the list, the words strange, but straightforward. Don't whistle inside the cavern, don't go past the 3rd marker, don't leave the gate open after 3 a.m. It felt like overkill for a job like this, but Hal's tone left no room for argument. As he walked me to the security room, I couldn't help but notice how the hum from the cavern seemed louder the closer we got. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, low and constant, like it was vibrating through my bones. "Don't worry," Hal said as he turned to leave. "It's quiet, most of the time." The way he said it stuck with me. Once Hal left, I sat down in the security room and pulled out the laminated sheet of rules. It was old, the edges frayed and stained, like it had been passed down through countless hands. At first glance, the rules didn't seem to make much sense. They were written in short, clipped sentences, almost like warnings scrawled in a hurry. 1. Always lock the gate behind you after sunset. This seemed standard enough. No one wanted kids or vandals sneaking into the caverns after hours. 2. Do not whistle inside the cavern. Weird, but maybe it had to do with the echoes disturbing the structure. 3. Never go past the 3rd marker. The markers were small wooden stakes along the main trail. I had no idea what lay beyond the 3rd one, but the warning was underlined twice in red. 4. If the humming stops, leave immediately and lock the gate. This one made me pause. The hum from the cavern was constant, so much so that I'd started tuning it out. The idea of it stopping sent a chill down my spine. If you hear footsteps that don't match your own, do not run. Stay still until they stop. My stomach twisted as I read this. Footsteps? Inside a locked cavern? If the lights flicker more than 3 times in a row, leave the security room and check the cameras manually. Do not look at the screens. I didn't even want to think about why that one was necessary. If someone comes to the gate asking for help after midnight, do not open it. No matter who they are or what they say, ignore them. This was the rule Hal had emphasized. It was written in bold letters at the bottom of the list. Do not break this rule. I leaned back in the chair, my heart pounding as I stared at the sheet. Each rule was more bizarre than the last, but Hal's warning echoed in my mind. Something about this place wasn't normal, and these rules weren't just suggestions. They felt like lifelines. The first couple of hours passed without much incident. The school had closed at 9 on a Wednesday. I sat in the security room, flipping through the pages of an old tourist brochure I'd found. The humming from the caverns droned on, steady and rhythmic, almost soothing if you didn't think too much about it. It wasn't until just past midnight that things started to feel off. The fluorescent light in the security room flickered once, then twice. My pulse quickened as I stared at it, willing it to stay on. It didn't flicker a third time, but the brief flashes of darkness made the shadows in the room feel deeper, more alive. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the old wiring, but then the footsteps started. At first, I thought they were mine. I'd gotten up to stretch my legs and walked a slow loop around the visitor center, my boots crunching softly against the worn wooden floor. But as I stopped to peer out one of the windows, I heard them again. Soft, deliberate steps echoing faintly behind me. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped, the silence almost louder than the footsteps had been. "It's just your imagination," I muttered under my breath. But when I turned around, the back door, which I was sure I'd locked, was open just a crack. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I walked over and shut it firmly, twisting the lock until I heard it click. At 12:30, the humming grew louder. It wasn't gradual. It spiked suddenly, like someone had turned up the volume on an invisible speaker. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound wasn't just external. It was inside me, vibrating through my bones. Just as quickly as it started, it stopped, dropping back to its usual steady rhythm, then quietly resumed. I couldn't hear the bathroom scrubbing its jets from the patient's room as they passed. I let out a shaky breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the caverns were awake. A little after 1 a.m., the phone rang. It wasn't my cell or the office landline, but the old rotary phone mounted on the wall. Hal hadn't mentioned it, and it hadn't rung once since I arrived. The shrill tone made me jump, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I hesitated, staring at the phone as it rang again and again. Something deep in my gut told me not to answer it. The ringing stopped on its own after the 6th ring. I thought I was in the clear, but then I heard it. A faint voice crackled through the cavern intercom system, the words distorted but unmistakable. "Alex, come inside." My stomach twisted. No one had called my name. Not Hal, not anyone. By 1:30, I was questioning whether I'd made a mistake taking this job. I tried to distract myself by checking the cameras. They showed the usual: empty hallways, dimly lit paths, and the yawning mouth of the cavern. But as I cycled through the feeds, I noticed something strange. One of the cameras, the one near the 3rd marker, showed movement. It wasn't clear, just a flicker of shadow against the rock walls, gone as quickly as it appeared. I rewound the footage, squinting at the grainy screen. There it was again. A figure, tall and thin, slipping out of view like it knew it was being watched. The humming from the cavern grew louder again, and this time, it didn't fade. I glanced at the clock. 1:45, still hours to go. The air in the visitor center felt heavier, harder to breathe, and every creak of the building made my skin crawl. The back door rattled, the lock shaking violently like someone or something was trying to get in. I didn't move. I couldn't. Eventually the rattling stopped, but the humming didn't. It was going to be a long night. By 2 a.m., my nerves were shot. The humming from the cavern had taken on an almost rhythmic quality, like a pulse, steady and inescapable. I tried to drown it out, but no matter where I moved, it followed me, burrowing into my skull. That's when I made my first mistake. The laminated rules sat on the counter next to me, their bold lettering glaring up like a silent warning. I'd been clinging to them all night, following every instruction to the letter. But now, staring at the security monitors, I felt something gnawing at the edges of my mind. Curiosity. The camera feed near the 3rd marker flickered again. This time, the shadow didn't dart away. It lingered, just at the edge of the frame, a tall, elongated figure, standing perfectly still. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen. The figure moved, stepping closer to the marker, its shape unnaturally thin and sharp. "Never go past the third marker," I muttered, the rule flashing in my mind like a red flag. But the figure wasn't past it yet. I grabbed the flashlight and keys before I could talk myself out of it. The cavern's entrance loomed in the distance, the hum growing louder with every step. My chest tightened as I unlocked the gate, the heavy iron squealing in protest. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the walls glistening with moisture. My footsteps echoed faintly, but I wasn't alone. Somewhere ahead, deeper in the cavern, I could hear faint whispers. They weren't clear, just a low murmur like a conversation happening out of earshot. The first marker came into view, a wooden stake planted firmly in the rocky ground. Beyond it, the shadows grew darker, the path twisting out of sight. I hesitated, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Turn back now," a voice in my head whispered. But I didn't. The second marker appeared, and with it, the whispers grew louder. This time, I could almost make out words. My name, repeated over and over, each syllable drawn out and distorted. The flashlight flickered. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a fleeting shadow that disappeared the moment I turned to look. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive hum in their place. Ahead, the third marker stood just a few feet away. I should have turned back. I knew it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it had to do with that figure I'd seen. In the drawn-out light at the far end of the tunnel, the four ancient men and women stood gazing out with wide eyes. I stepped closer, the third marker looming just ahead, and then the humming stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. My flashlight flickered again, then died, plunging me into total darkness. Panic clawed at my chest as I fumbled for the spare battery in my pocket. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold it steady. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding me from every direction. "Are you here?" a voice hissed, close enough that I could feel the breath on my neck. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The flashlight finally clicked back on, the beam cutting through the oppressive dark. I wasn't alone. The figure stood just beyond the third marker, its body unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone. It tilted its head, almost curiously, before stepping toward me. My legs refused to move. I could only watch as it reached out, one long, bony hand stretching toward me. "Alex," it whispered, its voice low and distorted, like it was echoing from inside a tunnel. The sound of my name snapped me out of my trance. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose rock. The flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering to the ground and rolling out of reach. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting between the figure and the cavern's entrance. Something glinted in the beam of the fallen flashlight, a book, half buried in the dirt near the third marker. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn. The whispers grew louder as I reached for it, the figure stepping closer with every passing second. My fingers brushed the cover, and a searing pain shot through my hand, like touching a live wire. The whispers stopped. I opened the book, the pages brittle and yellowed. Most of the text was illegible, scrawled in a language I didn't recognize, but one sentence stood out, written in shaky, uneven letters. "The rules aren't to keep you safe, they're to keep it inside." My blood ran cold as the figure let out a low, guttural growl. The flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting in and out. In the brief flashes of light, the figure's form twisted and shifted, growing taller, its limbs stretching further into the darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. The cavern walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier with every step. The whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic, like they were chasing me. The gate was in sight, but the figure was faster. It moved like a shadow, slipping between the rocks, its bony hand reaching for me. With a final burst of energy, I slammed the gate shut behind me, locking it just as the figure lunged forward. The humming returned, low and steady, but it wasn't comforting anymore. It felt like laughter. I collapsed against the gate, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The humming was back, but it felt different now, heavier, almost angry, vibrating through the air like a warning. Behind the gate, the figure stood motionless, its elongated limbs stretching out into the darkness of the cavern. Its head tilted slightly, as if watching me, waiting for my next move. Then it smiled, not with a mouth, there was no mouth, but with its entire presence. The air seemed to ripple around it, a low, guttural noise rising from somewhere deep within the cavern. The book was still in my hand, its leather cover slick with sweat. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the brittle pages, desperate for some kind of answer. The words seemed to shift on the page, rearranging themselves into something I could barely understand. One sentence burned itself into my mind. To lock the hollow is to offer the key. My stomach twisted. What did that mean? The humming grew louder, the sound pressing against my ears like a physical force. The figure began to move again, its steps slow and deliberate, its body twisting unnaturally as it approached the gate. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had locked the gate, followed the rules. Why wasn't it stopping? The figure's arm reached through the bars, its long, bony fingers stretching impossibly far. I froze, unable to move as its hand brushed against the edge of my shirt. "Alex," it whispered, its voice echoing inside my head. "You can't leave." The gate rattled violently, the hinges creaking under the strain. The metal groaned, bending inward as though it was being pulled apart. I had to do something. The book's words echoed in my mind. To lock the hollow is to offer the key. The key. My eyes darted to the lock on the gate, a rusted old thing that seemed barely functional. It felt like the answer was right in front of me, but I couldn't make sense of it. The figure's arm stretched further, its fingers curling around the lock. It didn't pull or twist, just held it, almost gently, like it was waiting for me to act. And then I understood. The rules weren't about keeping the figure out. They were about keeping it in. The lock wasn't a barrier. It was a tether. By locking the gate, I had anchored the figure to this place, but if I removed it, the thought sent a cold wave of dread through me. I didn't know what would happen, but I didn't have a choice. The gate was bending, the figure's body slipping through the widening gaps like smoke. My hands shook as I grabbed the key and turned it in the lock. The second the lock clicked open, the humming stopped. The silence was unbearable, stretching out into infinity. The figure froze, its head snapping toward me with an unnatural speed. For a moment everything was still, and then the cavern came alive. The ground shook violently, the walls groaning as cracks spread across their surface. Shadows poured out from the cavern's depths, writhing and twisting like living things. The figure stepped through the gate, its form shifting, growing larger with each step. Its body warped, its limbs stretching and twisting into shapes that defied logic. I stumbled back, the book slipping from my hands. The shadows surged toward me, their whispers deafening, their forms clawing at the edges of my vision. "Alex," the figure said, its voice no longer a whisper but a roar that echoed through the cavern. "You've opened the way." The air grew heavy, crushing me under its weight. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning as the figure loomed over me. "You're the key now," it said, its voice impossibly close. The shadows wrapped around me, cold and unyielding, pulling me toward the cavern's mouth. My screams were swallowed by the darkness, the world collapsing into a single point of unbearable silence. And then, nothing. When I woke up, the world felt different. I was standing in the cavern's entrance, the gate firmly locked behind me. The key was in my hand, cold and heavy, but I couldn't remember picking it up. The humming was back, steady and rhythmic, as if nothing had happened. The cracks in the walls were gone, the shadows nowhere to be seen. The cavern looked exactly as it had before, but something was wrong. I turned to leave, but my legs refused to move. My body felt heavy, rooted to the spot like the ground itself was holding me in place. On the counter in the security room, the laminated rules sat neatly where I'd left them. I could see them through the glass, the words clear as day. But there was something new. A line scrawled at the bottom in shaky, uneven handwriting. Rule 8. The Watchman can never leave. My chest tightened as I stumbled back toward the gate. I tried to unlock it, but the key wouldn't fit. The lock was rusted shut, unyielding, as if it had fused into the metal. Alex, a voice whispered behind me. I froze, the key slipping from my fingers and clattering to the ground. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned, expecting to see the figure from before. But it wasn't the figure. It was me. My reflection stared back at me, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its eyes were hollow, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. "You opened the way," it said, its voice a hollow echo of my own. I stumbled back, tripping over the gate's threshold and falling to the ground. When I looked up, the reflection was gone, but I wasn't alone. The shadows were back, shifting and writhing along the edges of the cavern. They whispered my name, their voices soft and relentless, a chorus of accusations and promises. "You're the key now," they said. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The humming grew louder, drowning out every thought, every sound, until it was the only thing I could hear. And then I understood. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were a trap, a test. The cavern didn't just need a watchman, it needed a keeper. And now, that keeper was me. As the shadows closed in, their cold embrace pulling me deeper into the cavern's endless dark, I realized the truth. No one ever leaves Silent Echo Caverns.